distinct privilege to be called by the Institute of Chinese Studies and to chair this session, this very important session on PLA Air Force and India's response, the trajectory of PLAF and India's response. And we have with us Angad Singh. Besides other things, he's a very nice photographer. If you haven't seen his photos on Twitter, you have been missing something. But we will get back to Angad a little later. I will just talk a little the overall view that I have, and then hand over to Angad for his piece. So the point is, as on date, there have been so many webinars, opinion pieces, meetings on China, and things happening up north. There seems to be a bit of China fatigue getting in. That's a dangerous thing, and that should not happen, because possibly, we shouldn't get lulled into it. Maybe there must be one of those n number of sayings of Sun Tzu, extend the dialogue happening up there amongst the corps commanders and lull your adversary into, saying that things will not happen. But it's important that we keep the issue alive, because it is very much a live issue. So as I see it, there are broadly three thrusts of PLA Air Force, of PLAF, that are. Angad may have different views and a different way of seeing things. But in my view, there are basically three directions that PLAF is taking. One is increasing numbers while upgrading the present generation of aircraft. So shall we say the inventory, which is slightly old, they are doing incremental innovations on that. Like, for example, the J-10A, the J-10B, and now the J-10C with thrust vectoring. So, and the ISR radar. So first thrust is to upgrade, modernize what they already have. Second is moving into niche territory, niche technology with like the J-20, the 31, and the oft-quoted H-20 long-range strategic bomber, which has been officially accepted that it is being designed, but the Twitter says it will be a flying wing design, but we do not know what it is. But it's almost 2.5 to 3 years now that it was officially accepted that that is coming up. And the third one is modernizing its training regimen, and that is important. They are literally throwing out of the window the way their training schedules, their ethos was the Russian way, or the USSR, the Soviet way rather, and getting on to an absolutely different, realistic training pattern. So these are the three thrusts that I see that PLAF is on to. Besides, of course, getting into space in a big way, and that I suppose Angad will be speaking on. If we take a bird's eye view of where PLAF is and where it's going, what we need to be seeing is, and studying, is how is it integrating in the various theaters that the Chinese have formed, 5 theater commands that they've formed. And of course, China is pouring billions, absolutely billions, into research and development and into manufacturing. So without much ado, I would be handing over to Angad. But before that, a few words on him. He's the project coordinator with the ORF, the Observer Research Foundation, and he researches into matters defense and military issues, focusing on air power, the technology associated with air power, and network-centric operations. And as I said before, a keen aviation photographer. Follow him on Twitter for some lovely photographs. Over to you, Angad.
Thank you, AVM Bahadur, for that very kind introduction, and ICS for putting this together and having us here. So I'm going to start off with, like AVM Bahadur, with a few words on just the India-China air power balance, and then sort of zoom into a few, what I see as a few key issues, and some of those issues I'll have graphics to go with them. In essence, I'm inclined to agree with AVM Bahadur's opening statement, which is, the China fatigue can be incredibly dangerous, especially at this point, as you'll see later on. But essentially, I feel like the domestic conversation around air power in particular tends to be either a Pakistan-centric view or a domestically centered view that is engineered for domestic consumption and domestic feel-good factor. And I think that is incredibly dangerous because parity or relative superiority with against the Pakistan Air Force is irrelevant when you have the PLA at your doorstep and, as AVM Bahadur noted, increasing in size, increasing in capability. They like us, the PLAF peaked in aircraft numbers around the 70s and 80s with massive acquisition and production programs. But since then, they've prioritized modest incremental modernization over that large-scale aggressive expansion that was sort of the norm in both our countries in the 70s and 80s. The exposure to the Western world and Western operations and doctrines post the 1980s greatly impacted how the PLA Air Force approaches technology and operations since then. And again, it's been a very, very gradual and slow evolution. The evolution is there to see. Their association with the Pakistan Air Force and by association then a third-party association with the way Western Air Forces and NATO fly and fight and operate has been key to this. You'll have the Pakistan Air Force at Red Flags and Anatolian Eagles and exercises all over Europe and the Western world. And then you'll have those best practices transposed onto the PLAF when the Pakistanis and the Chinese do their exercises like Shaheen and, of course, various personnel exchanges and personnel interforce cooperation. The 1990s was sort of the watershed for both countries when they moved into this fourth generation paradigm full force. India, of course, had Mirages and MiG-29s in the 80s, but both countries adopted the Sukhoi 27, the flanker family, enthusiastically in the 90s. And where that had a sort of trickle-down effect into Chinese manufacturing and domestic development in the form of the J11 and the various variants that followed, and the J10, which uses the same engine as the Sukhoi 27, that the same trajectory wasn't necessarily followed in India. And in India, we sort of backed that Sukhoi family on its own without sort of cross-pollinating, or at least without cross-pollinating to the degree that the Chinese were able to. And it's worth noting here that the Indian and Chinese economies were far closer then than they are now. So in terms of being driven by economic considerations, the window of opportunity was more available in the 90s when these decisions were in their infancy than they are today, where, of course, China's economy has exploded. The principal difference between the air power of India and China, and I'm talking purely in terms of platforms and weaponry and technology, is, again, as AVM Bahadur highlighted in his opening remarks, bombers. They have H-6 bombers at present. They have, therefore, range and payload carrying capacity that is unmatched in the region. And those bombers have been continuously upgraded, new engines, new avionics, up to the most recent H-6K variant, which might as well be a new aircraft in terms of its airframe and structures and avionics and engines, and, of course, payload. The combat radius of the H-6 is in the region of about 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers. And coupled with the latest air-launched cruise missiles in the Chinese inventories, things like the sort of KD-20 class of cruise missile, its strike radius from takeoff is somewhere in the region of about 4,500 kilometers, which is, again, unmatched in the region, except, of course, by local US air forces, air and sea forces. Areas where the PLA has traditionally lagged behind India, and this is more to do, I feel, with the Chinese foreign policy and their ability or willingness to be a regional, a benign regional player, are airlift, where India has traditionally had better access to transport and tanking than in both terms of quality and quantity than the Chinese. Again, that gap has inverted as of this year or last year with the large-scale induction of the Y-20. The Chinese now have a larger strategic airlift fleet than India, and it's set to only grow. And as the Y-20 airlifter gets new high bypass Chinese indigenous turbofan engines, the capability gap will only continue to grow. And the other area is tankers and ISR. Now, the tanker gap is a unique one for China because it's something they have not been able to address except for sort of piecemeal jury-rig solutions like H6 based tankers and the odd IL-78 that they've been able to secure from around the world. But the ISR gap has been bridged in a massive way by the Chinese. They have slapped air surveillance and surface surveillance and electronic surveillance systems onto just about every airframe in their inventory, from the sort of C-130 equivalent Y-8 to the IL-76 equivalent aircraft. And of course, now with the Y-20, they have a domestic platform that's ripe for modification for surface surveillance, air surveillance, and tanking. So these were traditional areas that India had a very distinct edge that have also now in the last 10 to 15 years been aggressively eroded. Over the last year, India has made incredible strides in its air-launched weapons. It's been a long time coming, and a lot of people, myself included, have argued that India's air-launched inventory is in urgent need of a comprehensive relook in terms of what you set out to achieve, the operating environment, and your target set, and so on. But also in terms of maximizing your bang for buck when you spend on consumables, because you can't reuse a bomb. You can't bring it. I mean, you can bring it back unused, but it doesn't fly back to target. Let's say if it fly back to base if it misses its target or if its target is unavailable. Bombs and missiles are incredibly expensive for what they offer, and in a budget-constrained environment like India's, standardization was something that was just missing, and there were attempts made in that direction by using certain missiles across different fleets of aircraft. In the 80s, you had the European Magic that was used on the MiG-21, and then that was flipped around later when the Russian R-73 was used on the Mirage, things like that. But those were sort of small-scale solutions to a big-scale problem. Thankfully, now we look like we're moving towards standardizing on both short-range air-to-air missiles. We have a domestic BBR missile that is, by all accounts, superior to the Russian equivalent that we've been forced to make do with since the Bison and the MiG-20, since the Bison and the Su-30 were inducted. And of course, we now have a anti-radiation missile, a domestic anti-radiation missile that is critical in today's emissions-dense, electronics and networking-dense operating paradigm. One area where I think India has done well relative to the PLAF is in its guided weapons, guided air-to-surface weapons. The PLAF was slow to sort of adopt GPS-guided and laser-guided weapons, primarily due to a lack of access to technology, which of course didn't hamper us in the 90s, where we inducted LGBs, that is laser-guided bombs, targeting pods from the Israelis, targeting pods from the French as early as the 1980s, and so on and so forth. That momentum has been kept up in India, but the disparity of systems in service is still a concern. And I think there's a lot of room in the Indian situation to look at standardizing one or two classes of laser-guided bombs, one or two classes of GPS or NS-guided weapons, and things like that. And again, those are clearly in the works. And this is a common talking point, especially for me. And just to make the point that it's not all horrible and things are moving in a positive direction. This is one very heartening development for the Indian Air Force. And now back to China and sort of the big elephant in the room, especially when it comes to the public discourse on the PLAF. And this is the niche technology that AVM Bahadur alluded to, which is, I won't sort of go into it in terms of platforms, just the technology, which is stealth. And that is something that there is no regional answer to. And that, I think, is part of an assessment of the PLAF that the Indian public discourse often misses. The PLAF, China, is not so much postured against India as it is postured against Taiwan, the USA, Japan, Korea, and so on. That combined military power that China is postured against dwarfs what India can bring to the table. And therefore, by definition, China's response has to at least try to dwarf what India brings to the table. So the danger then is that because China is on this accelerated development R&D induction path, the danger then for India becomes that you'll tend to fall behind. And you'll tend to fall behind, particularly if you are focused on countering current or previous generation technology that Pakistan is fielding. And so that blind spot, I think, needs to be turned a little on its head. A small look at the numbers, just for any of those order of battle people out there that want to know what sort of numbers we're looking at. The PLAF and the IAF are vastly different in size. It's almost a 2:1 ratio. However, what faces India is essentially the Western Theater Command, which is on paper not that impressive. It is centered on a small nucleus of high-end contemporary aircraft, that is your Sukhoi J-11 variants, and a large number of J-7, that is MiG-21 derivatives, JH-7 strike aircraft, and J-8 interceptor / strike aircraft. So on paper, the dedicated Western Theater Command forces facing India, which would be Western Air Command, Central Air Command, and Eastern Air Command, are outmatched. But as Indian air power practitioners are so fond of saying, air power is above theaters. Air power cannot be constrained to a theater. Therefore, it's pointless to assume that only Western Theater Command assets will be committed against India, and that, as if to make that point, the Chinese are, as of last month anyway, had a detachment of H-6 bombers in Kashi, in Kashgar. They've been rotating non-WTC assets in and out of Kashi and Hotan since time immemorial, but certainly during this last year or so. So there is no question that in the air power balance, China can bring to bear an overwhelming force against the Indian Air Force, which will, of course, then have to muster its own overwhelming force and cannot just say that, elements of these commands and elements of these areas will be China focused and elements will be Pakistan focused. This is, I think, the point that was made or tried to be made in April 2018 when the Air Force carried out exercise Gagan Shakti, which was, to my memory, at least in my lifetime, the largest scale air exercise conducted, where the entire Air Force was effectively mobilized and simulated sequential two-front operation, which is to say they pushed all their assets west and then pushed all their assets north and east, Pakistan and China. What it did also show, though, was the limitation that a simultaneous two-front contingency will be very difficult to address with the current force levels. I'm going to, just to make my point about the regional balance, I'm going to pull up some maps. How do I? Just give me a second.
Someone, have you given him screen sharing rights?
Uh,
You have to give him screen sharing rights.
So he has just got logged out. He's back in.
He's back. Angad, you are muted. Unmute yourself. Okay.
So I had a strange, I think it just crashed. Could someone enable screen sharing at my end?
You'll just get the rights.
There we go.
Yeah, you can do it now, Angad. Yeah. Your co-host, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, it's starting now. Okay, just go full screen.
So when we talk about the Western Theater Command, one of the common refrains one hears is that the Tibetan plateau is unforgiving, and the high altitude is a limitation that the PLAF cannot get around. Now that is fundamentally correct. Physics doesn't bend for the will of the Chinese Communist Party. The problem, I think, is that there's a degree of blindness to what China can do to mitigate these weaknesses, and also perhaps a degree of overconfidence in how a confrontation might play out. This is not 65, 71. This would not be World War II style sustained bombing campaigns where you have aircraft constantly pounding at each other's bases, trying to take them out of the equation. These are, by definition, in fact, by both countries' doctrines, are going to be short, sharp conflicts. In which case, the longevity of a given base is not critical to the outcome of the conflict. Nevertheless, the Chinese have done what they can to mitigate those high altitude weaknesses. And I think it's worth noting that it's clear that they've decided not to try and kill themselves trying to figure out how to solve this problem. So the Tibetan plateau bases have long runways and little else, because I think the Chinese know that they are inherently limited in what they can offer. So they are, in essence, glorified forward operating bases. What isn't are the bases in Xinjiang, which are basically the ones I mentioned earlier, Kashi and Hotan. Now, they seem to have taken a leaf out of our book when you look at, say, an area like Srinagar, which is also, it's a valley base, but it's relatively high altitude, where they're now putting up a multitude of bases in Xinjiang near the established bases. So a few hundred kilometers south of Kashi, you have a new airfield. A few hundred kilometers east of Hotan, you have a new airfield, and more are planned. So they're essentially giving the Indian Air Force more targets to shoot at and dividing our strike power. 10 years ago wouldn't have been a problem. You would have taken out Kashi, you would have taken out Hotan, and you've solved half the problem. As on date, they've doubled that target set and are set to add more targets going forward. A common Indian criticism of the Chinese basing in this area is that they don't have hardened aircraft shelters, which again brings me back to that point about short, sharp conflicts where the longevity of the base itself isn't that crucial to the outcomes. Nevertheless, clearly someone in China is listening, because inside of a year, a set of hardened aircraft shelters have come up at Kashi. And to the question of having longer runways being easier to bisect with bombs and therefore put out of action, again, the Chinese seem to have taken this to heart, because in March or April this year, there was no construction activity at Hotan. And today, sort of 6 months, 6-7 months later, they have the beginnings of a second runway and a parallel taxi track at Hotan. So I'm just going to bring those photographs up. Hotan is clearly an important base for them, because as you can see here, we have a dedicated UAV operating apron just below these red, what appear to be mothballed J7s. You can see a couple of UAVs on the apron. So this is something they're obviously comfortable with in this area. We've seen UAVs operate even from TAR bases. I think with their low takeoff weights and high lift wings, I don't think the high altitude is such a penalty on UAVs as it might be on tactical aircraft and certainly on bombers. Again, Hotan, enormous runways, lots of parking space. I don't think that taxi track is suitable for flight operations, but it is long and extends the length of the runway. We can see flanker class aircraft here, J-11 Su-27 class aircraft here. Transports, and it's not particularly clear, but these two here are AWACSs. This is a recent image from October this year. And here's an overview of the airfield. So here north of the runway, you can see there's an absolute surplus of parking space. Down here is the UAV operating apron. And then almost a separate airport of its own is this new runway that's coming up. And from no construction activity in March, April this year, you can see that as of October this year, they've already begun laying tarmac on parts of this surface. And that is an incredible speed. And it just shows how seriously they are taking this confrontation and the India issue as a whole. Kashi, this is what I was referring to earlier. These on the far left are a group of H-6 bombers that are not based in Kashi, but are clearly here on rotation. And this is a relatively recent photograph from mid-October. So call it signaling, call it what you want. Here they are, and they can certainly operate from here in numbers. You can see the beginnings of a new runway or taxiway on the far side, on the north side of the main single runway of Kashi. And here's the principal military apron of Kashi, below which you can see this is an air defense installation, again signaling that they are serious about this as a military base. And to the far left, you have these new hardened aircraft shelters that I was talking about. So clearly, the Chinese are alive to their own limitations of terrain and geography. And with Kashi and Hotan and the kind of forces that they can host there, the Chinese can comfortably sort of hold at risk all of Jammu and Kashmir certainly, and parts of northern parts of Punjab, Himachal, and Uttarakhand. Now, again, this is not to say that India is caught napping in this relative to this. But there was a Belfer Center study earlier this year that laid out why India is in a much better position still geographically, simply because the multiplicity of bases and the flexibility of basing of air power that is inherent to air power complicates the PLAF's targeting. We by definition have given them more to shoot at and more to miss, and they have given us a small handful of targets to shoot at should it come to that. The last two things I want to talk about, and I do realize I've gone well over my time, which I hadn't planned on doing, are sort of back to the technological elements to this competition. Stealth and the domestic R&D production situation. Now with stealth, at the risk of being redundant, I'm going to start by clarifying what stealth is and what it isn't. It isn't invisibility. It isn't invulnerability. It is a tactical advantage. It is essentially a tool in a box of other tools But with that caveat out of the way, it is arguably the most important tool in the box, the most useful tool in that box. And it is definitely a big problem if you are facing stealth without stealth or counter stealth capabilities of your own. Now, this is an issue that the Indian air power paradigm has not addressed to my satisfaction. We are far, far, far behind on fielding a stealth aircraft of our own. This is not to say that the decision to leave the FGFA program was a bad one, the Indo-Russian co-development. I think the ability to assess a program and decide that it doesn't meet your needs and to pull out early than to double down on what would be a very, very costly mistake has to be respected. And that sort of pragmatic decision making is so rare in Indian defense in general that I don't think anyone can say that pulling out of the FGFA was a bad idea. That said, it does leave us without a fifth generation aircraft, at least until the early 2030s. And the problem, of course, then is that we're looking at the Chinese have already fielded the J-20 in frontline units. They are beginning to field, or will be shortly beginning to field, J-20s equipped, fully indigenous J-20s, that is to say, equipped with indigenous engines, again, to frontline units, not to testing units, in short order, or it's already happening. So this is an issue where, at least in the public domain, and certainly also in private conversations, there seems to be a gap, an emerging gap, and a gap that is set to only grow wider. There are ways to counter stealth. We've all heard about various low frequency radars and bistatic radar systems and things like that. But these are all predicated on a networked cooperative engagement, a capability that we haven't seen demonstrated in India yet. Where we are lucky if one set of sensors and weapons talks to each other to complete a kill chain. So to have networked low frequency radars feeding targeting information to either airborne aircraft, interceptors, or surface to air missiles, things like that, is a capability that we haven't seen demonstrated yet in India. And frankly, I would argue that it is that sort of certainly less expensive and likely quicker to achieve technological counter to stealth that we should be pursuing. Because putting all of India's counter stealth eggs essentially in the AMCA basket is risky, not just because there's no way of knowing when the AMCA will come out, but simply because it, by definition, leaves you open for the better part of a decade. And then that, of course, brings me neatly to my final talking point, which is the indigenous R&D. Now, this is a topic of I think great importance to everyone that follows Indian air power. Certainly to AVM Bahadur, who's written extensively on indigenization, on production and R&D and things like that. It's easy to say that Indian R&D has been terrible, and to close this program and close that program, and this hasn't worked and that hasn't worked. I think the main issue is there's no real oversight, and there's no real focus on what has to come, when, where, and how. So the issue is how does one entrust the direction, the steering of indigenous R&D? And I think the PLA has managed it. Their system, granted, is set up in a way that facilitates that level of control. Ours is not. But I think one of the mistakes we've made with domestic R&D is to allow R&D to become the means, not the end. And I'm not saying that R&D has to always deliver a product. In fact, that's the other extreme of dangerous thinking when it comes to managing R&D. R&D has to be focused basis your requirements and your budgets. If one aircraft system is a bridge too far, then 4 certainly will be. If a 4th generation aircraft is a bridge too far, then a 5th generation certainly will be. If a certain class of weapon has taken 20 years to develop and deliver, there's no reason to suggest that the next generation of it will be any easier. So I think there's been a lack of self-reflection, both at the level of the user, and I think this is just purely down to the lack of continuity in leadership posts, which is why I think defense R&D needs a different style of management. You cannot have either uniformed officers or scientists with fixed tenures and fixed promotion profiles and fixed leadership designations managing projects that should be on 10, 15-year horizons. And the best place to get an example of this is to look at the F-35, the Joint Program Office. The officers chosen to head that office have long tenures specifically to ensure this level of continuity. And then the lack of continuity actually ends up in really basic mistakes and oversights. And I think the most recent example that comes to mind, not apropos India-China, but just a missed opportunity that comes from a lack of continuity in leadership. India is the only country, HAL is the only company in the world that makes this light transport aircraft, the Dornier 228. Despite being the only company that makes this aircraft in the world, India does not own the rights to this aircraft. The rights to the aircraft are held by a Swiss company called RUAG, which has, as of last month, been bought by an American company called General Atomics. As part of the manufacture of the Dornier 228, India has completely indigenized and built the erstwhile Garrett, now Honeywell TPE 331 turboprop engine. It's a fabulously successful engine worldwide. And of course, the Indian military experience with the 228 and the Garrett 331 engine has been stellar. It is also the engine that powers the most ubiquitous UAV in the world, the MQ-9 Reaper, built by General Atomics. You would think that it would be obvious then that India adopt a known UAV engine for its own UAV program. But instead, the UAV program, what is sometimes referred to as Tapas, sometimes referred to as Rustam 2, I think Tapas is the official new designation, is a de novo program. It draws on no existing aerospace knowledge. It doesn't even draw on an engine that India owns and builds in country today. So there is a fundamental disconnect in how domestic R&D is serving domestic air power. And I think, not today, not tomorrow, but I think that will end up being the deciding differentiating factor between Indian and Chinese air power going forward. We will forever be able to sustain our air power, whereas the Chinese will go on to eventually expand on theirs. I think I'll leave it with that and move to questions.
Thank you, Angad.
I apologize. That was literally double the time I was allotted.
No, it's okay. It's absolutely fine, Angad. You just about 35 minutes, and that was good. And to the participants, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will take them on. They will keep coming to us. But before we get to them, I have a few, shall we talk about what you spoke, Angad?
Please.
This is taking off from the last portion of your talk, domestic R&D and working for domestic air power, upgradation. And I absolutely agree on the fact that there needs to be continuity. We cannot have people changing because a next rank is due or a next posting is due or your tenure in Delhi or Bangalore or wherever is over and you have to move. But these are all bureaucratic things. We all experienced that and we have been pretty vocal about it. Hopefully, I think things will change, not for any other reason, because each of the services now has with different names, Directorate of not indigenization, but research,
R&D or
sort of a
design,
thing,
right?
R&D or a design, so with different names. So that is there, and that's a good thing that that is happening. I think what I feel is that we need something, if you can use the word czar. You need a czar for R&D, defense R&D, who has a longish tenure. I mean, I take it that, for example, there was a czar for Delhi Metro. That's how the Delhi Metro came up. He was
Absolutely.
actually a czar. And you have to trust our own people. The odd bad fish will be there. That's fine. But everybody is not bad. So from that point of view, Angad, we've been hearing of this Aeronautical Commission or Aerospace Commission for the last 30 years. Do you have any idea where is it, or is there any progress on that?
I do recall a beautifully drafted document. It must have been 10, 12 years ago. That I think it was the Aeronautical Society of India that put forward this document. And what made it different from the usual sort of surface level proposals, surface level proposals, it's easy to say that, we want change and leave it at that. But this document went into great detail. And it was one of those pragmatic documents, because at the end of the day, particularly in the Indian system, but in every system in the world, you fall victim to a bit of empire building, a bit of the crab mentality. And it's easy to say that it doesn't happen or it shouldn't happen, but it's a fact of life. It's human nature. And this document really addressed those issues, that, how do we make sure that all stakeholders are kept happy, are given something to do and to achieve under this new paradigm. And I think it was Dr. Naseem Zaidi, who was chairman or head of the Aeronautical Society in those days, who presented this document, and that was the last I heard of it. But I mean, if that can be dusted off, or if that can be pursued under a new name, a new guise, I think that will certainly help. We've already got too much duplication, and as a country with resource constraints and budgetary constraints, the one thing you cannot afford is duplication. And redundancy is one thing. That having a backup, having a safety, having a plan B, that's one thing. But to spend national resources on something that's going absolutely nowhere is, I think, should be criminal.
Okay, I agree with you. Okay, can we talk a little bit, the timelines involved with respect to an aircraft coming up on the flight line from design? We all understand that. But in the recent, shall I say 3 months, there has been a flurry of missile testing. And you did talk about air-launched weapons being a positive aspect for Indian air power. A little more words, a few more explanation on that, Angad?
It's incredibly detailed to go into specifics, but essentially what I see as positive steps in the near term are the Astra BVR missile, the NG anti-radiation new generation. I think it's called Rudram now.
Rudram.
It has a formal name now. And from what I'm told, all these missiles are sort of jumping off points for further development, improvement, and of course, other variants of these missiles. So Rudram will not just be an anti-radiation missile. It will eventually evolve into other classes of air-to-surface guided weapon, whether it's anti-ship or just, sort of a Maverick class anti-surface missile. So these developments, I think, are important. And the only gripe I have is that they could have happened, 15 years sooner, but better late than never.
Okay. We'll not take more of your time because we have a flurry of questions coming up. I think there is some Samanvay. I think do you have some point as a discussion before we go into questions?
Sure. I actually won't take too much time. I'll just put a couple of questions to Angad. One would be focusing going back to China and say Tibet. what are the main obstacles you see to the Indian Air Force operating offensively over there, say in Tibet or even Xinjiang? We have often heard about these multi-tiered air defense networks over there. So could you just comment on the status of these networks, how much of a threat they actually pose, and what are the developments you see India pursuing that could negate them? You already spoke about the anti-radiation missile, but what else as part of a holistic planning process?
So I'll take that backwards. So the Indian response obviously will be suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses, and how they would prosecute that would be through jammers or kinetic weaponry like the NG arm or existing X-31 and so on missiles. The Chinese air defense in Tibet is essentially a response to their limitations, their physical limitations, because of the geography of Tibet. You can only put up so many defensive counter-air, combat air patrol sorties from these high altitude bases for a number of reasons, not just, let's say there's a base with an incredibly long runway where payload is not a limit, but really prosaic things come in the way, things like wear and tear on brakes and tires. A longer runway means higher takeoff and landing speeds, which will take a toll on brakes and tires and will reduce aircraft serviceability in very short order. So things like that, 100%, they do constrain Chinese aircraft operations in Tibet. And that is exactly what the layered air defenses aim to mitigate. So it is a challenge simply because that is their first line of defense, and it has therefore seen consequently the kind of investment and impetus to make sure there is an AD net over that region.
So just to take that one further, and I'll just stop after that. You spoke about the kinetic weapons. How about the jamming aspect of it, this suppressing air defenses? So whether India does that, and somehow adopting a Growler-like platform. Could you speak on the status of Indian strides in just electronic warfare and so on and so on?
Again, I tend not to favor platform-based discussions simply because it's not a platform issue. It's a doctrine, concept of operations, technology issue. And again, electronic warfare is a bit of a cat and mouse game. There are cases in which you will want to jam radars and sensors on your way in or out of a mission. And there are cases where you want to take them out hard kill to ensure mission success. Those decisions are best left to the planners. But I will point out one thing that sort of people tend to forget in these very exciting discussions about technology and platforms, especially in today's world where just about every tactical aircraft and tactical ground platform has an electronic warfare system on board, is if you're emitting microwave radiation, you are visible. So in a lot of cases, you might prefer to go in emission silent and hard kill an enemy radar than to go in emitting with your jammer and announce to every radar in the vicinity that, hey, here I am in time and space, please come shoot me. So there are, it's very easy to look at the Growler, for example, and say, oh, this is a high-end platform that's all very bells and whistles. But everything has its use cases, horses for courses, no matter how you look at it.
Sure. I think we'll move on to just.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Samanbhai. Thank you, Samanbhai. We've got almost 5 questions now. We'll get on first from Mr. Vignesh. And he asks about air-to-air refueling capability of the Chinese in Tibet. What is it? And there is a second question on EW jammers, their capability on their aircraft, like the J-11s, etc. So you could take on the EW jammer and the refueling one, air-to-air refueling second, because I'll add on something to that.
So, I mean, again, I'm at pains to point out, especially with EW, it is the most closely guarded subject. No Air Force talks about what they have or what they know about the other sides. And so it is with ours, and so it is with the PLAF. So it's very hard to nail down what their capabilities are. That aside, from air shows and brochures and things like that, one gets a decent handle on what each force brings to the table. So as far as China's, if I understand the question correctly, their airborne EW is concerned, the EW systems that they carry on tactical aircraft are pretty much what any tactical aircraft worldwide would carry in the sense that they are what one would characterize as self-protection jammers, not standoff jammers or escort jammers. So it's likely to be a DRFM sort of contemporary DRFM jammer. What is the capability of China with regard to tanking over Tibet? Was that the?
That's correct. That's correct.
I think I mentioned briefly, China's tankers are a bit of a blind spot. They don't have many. What they have aren't great. And given the payload limitations over Tibet, tankers are key. Now, having said that, they have tools in the box to mitigate those shortcomings. One, of course, is the bomber. If you have a strike range of 4,500 kilometers, tankers become much, much less critical. And if you have large aircraft, again, of the flanker family or even J-10s, which have a fairly decent unrefueled range or endurance, then at least your defensive posture isn't too badly harmed by not having a tanker. If you're doing DCA, if you're doing caps over Tibet or over your home base with a J-10 or a J-11, the lack or presence of a tanker doesn't really move the needle on combat efficiency. It does on strike, but again, they can mitigate that by using larger, longer range platforms like bombers and Sukhoi J-11 variants.
Okay, I'll add on to that. It finally gets down to tactics. Just remember that as you rightly said, Angad, they have a problem with tankers. Just remember that the IL-78 presently can refuel only Russian origin aircraft. That is the Sukhoi 27 and the variants. The H-6K is able to refuel the Chinese variants. They are trying to get over this. Now, this is a big disconnect. And the numbers too of the H-6K, the air-to-air refueler and the IL-78 are very few. That's number one. Second, any flight refueler is a high-value asset. When we think of refuelers, you think that the refuelers will come, the aircraft will come, refuel and go for strike. But that flight refueler has to maintain a safe distance. Otherwise, that is the first thing that the Indian Air Force would be waiting for. Okay. So the flight refuelers have to operate at a safe distance, just like the AWACS have to operate at a safe distance from the, shall I say, the area of engagement. So when you're talking of Tibet, you're talking of the Chinese airfields, and you're talking of the flight refuelers where they already have a big problem. So, and they have to stay sufficiently back. It's not so simple to augment ranges. You talked about the H-6Ks and the bombers and the air-launched cruise missiles which they have got, which effectively increases the range of their strike. Yes, that's a possibility. Once again, you have to talk numbers. How many H-6Ks they have got, how many cruise missiles they would have, and how many targets can they take on. Right. So it's a big game.
Even with, say, flanker family variants, it would be the number of tankers would dictate the size and efficacy of your strike package, simply because of what, as you say, a tanker can only refuel so many aircraft, and it has to be a certain safe distance away from the forward edge of the FIBA, the forward edge of the battle area.
That's correct. So there are a lot of issues there, and as far as but we must keep at the back of our mind that the Y-20, which is an indigenous aircraft coming up, that would surely. So
that's the big ace, because once they've sorted out the teething problems with the Y-20, and more importantly, once they put that more efficient high bypass engine on it, it looks very attractive as a sort of do-it-all platforms. Put tanker, put AWACS, not J-Stars, ground surveillance, anything of that sort.
That's right. The Y-20 presently with the Russian engines, the D-30, It can carry 50 tons roughly. The Y-20 has flown last week with all 4 WS-20 engines. There's a photograph on Twitter by one of the persons, and people have commented on that. Now, if that is true, then it's a big step that they have got, because then the payload goes up to 66 tons, almost as good as a C-17.
Right.
And that would be the base, as you rightly say, for AWACS as well as for the future FRS. But while parallel development carries on, we must remember that they would tend to build up the airlift capabilities, because that's where they have very few ILs considering the size and the Pacific coastline that they've got. Okay, we move to the next question from Mr. Nirmay Sarkar. What defense do we have against the Chinese UAVs and UCAVs?
I'm assuming by UAVs and UCAVs, this means sort of your standard male hail turboprop UAVs with surface to air to surface missiles.
What I feel is, I think maybe his question is sort of linked with the things happening which have happened in Armenia and Azerbaijan. That sort of.
Right. So okay, so that becomes a much broader question. At the most basic level, you shoot them down or you jam them. But the nitty-gritties of that answer will be very complicated, especially when you move beyond the Air Force versus Air Force question, because these will be used to target your ground forces, your maneuver forces, things like that. And without sort of running down this rabbit hole, I just want to point out that maneuvering mobile air defense is a big gap, I feel. And of course, it was exposed in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. Mobile air defense is critical, and you can't sort of deploy high-end Buk Kub class SAMs as static SAMs. They are meant to be mobile, so they have to accompany your maneuver forces into the field and protect them. They are perfectly capable of engaging and destroying at least male, that is medium altitude, long endurance UAVs. There's no reason not to use them that way. But yeah, I think fundamentally we will have to move away from that mobile gun, your Shilka and things like that paradigm, and into a dedicated air defense missile, mobile air defense missile paradigm. If you have any intention of protecting your maneuver forces.
Yeah, and the threat is real. There is no doubt about it. Only point is we should not get carried away because Azerbaijan and Armenia, that conflict which was widely publicized was at a certain altitude. When we're talking of the problems come up with what's happening around you. When you're talking of Eastern Ladakh, you're talking of 14,500 feet base. So those guys have to be launched, coordinated, and if a helicopter or a fighter has a problem with aerodynamics of lifting, please imagine these small UAVs or UCAVs that one is thinking, their capability reduces tremendously at those altitudes of 15 to 16,000 feet. So there are major issues, but yes, electronic, as you rightly said, Angad, the electronic jamming or deflection, that's one way out. And of course, there are kinetic ways too. Question from Mr. Shiv Shastri. Will China move to Western style avionics or their standards, taking Pakistan's help? Because the interaction with Pakistan is a lot, and China would have sort of studied the electronics available, avionics available with the PAF.
Again, yeah, I mean, everyone, all forces, all countries have to keep an eye on what the other guys are doing, what their adversaries and their competition is up to. So in that regard, just from a purely technological, techno-commercial point of view, I would imagine China is doing everything they can to gain access to, and of course, we know they have gained access to various Western systems and programs. So it's a question of time, funding, getting it to that point, getting it across the finish line. But I'm sure they're looking at everything that they can get their hands on, whether it's avionics or aerostructures or anything.
Yeah, another question from him, or maybe it's from someone else. Maybe I've missed the name. Cross-linking of platforms by India to cross-domain shooting, basically interlinking or network centricity. Where have we reached as far as this is concerned?
So if I understand that correctly, that's to do with that my earlier point about and countering stealth through. So yeah, I mean it's a well understood. I think as on date, I don't think anyone, barring the U.S. Navy, has demonstrated this level of cooperative engagement across a multitude of sensors and platforms. Of course, the U.S. Navy has to because their operating horizons are critical for them. I mean, they don't have the advantage of radar shadow or mountains or things like that. A ship at sea is a very lonely place to be, and so they have to make sure no one gets to them. But the lesson from that, of course, is that cooperative engagement is your near-term best bet to counter stealth. Have we demonstrated that ability? No. Are we working towards it? I do not know, but I believe as a subset or a natural outgrowth of things like IACCS that the Air Force has put in place, the building blocks are certainly in place, and the situational awareness element of cooperative engagement is in place and improving as we speak. And as any practitioner, I'm talking to one, as any practitioner will tell you, situational awareness is key to this field of air warfare. So that's the first step. That's the first block. So taking it through to that natural conclusion of a cooperative engagement capability across platforms and weapons, I would imagine is a question of when, not if.
Yeah, you talked of the IACCS, and for the benefit of viewers, that is one program that the Air Force is pushing very hard. The ground element is almost complete. If I can use the word, I can remove the word almost also. So it's complete. The airborne element is really being pushed by the Air Force. Some elements are in place. I think we can just leave it at that. And all future wars, the side which cannot interlink, which cannot have systems talking to each other for cross-domain sensing and shooting, both sending messages, the data transfers in real time, will be at a big disadvantage. There's no doubt about it. The Air Force understands that, just like the other side understands. So that is something that we are really pushing.
I think it's worth noting to that point that this is something that it's not headline making news, and it doesn't make the front pages every week, but it is something that the Air Force is very alive to, and you can tell simply because of the effort they put into equipping even legacy platforms with the equipment, the avionics required to plug into this network. So it's something that the Air Force views as non-negotiable. It's not something that, so-and-so aircraft is on its way out, so we can do without network operations for 5 years and then it'll retire. They want to make sure everything is plugged in and talking to each other. It's not easy, but they are working towards it all the time.
That's correct. And to be truthful, it costs a lot of money. So just keep that at the back of our mind. Question from Mr. Abhishek Kale, and that's on the YouTube channel. The Kaveri engine. The Kaveri engine, can it be used in the IJT or for smaller fighter jets?
No, it can't be used in the IJT. But see, here, this is the thing with R&D, or rather with S&T, science and technology. There's no harm in failing. There's no, the sky doesn't fall down if your incredibly difficult engine doesn't work. It's not easy. It is harder than rocket science, if I may. So Kaveri didn't work. So what? There's a knowledge pool. There's this whole ecosystem of machine, of hardware and sort of mental software that exists now around that system. It's incumbent on us then to leverage it. What I believe would be a mistake would be to keep beating the dead horse, right? The horse is dead. Now break it down for parts and use what you can. So persisting down a dead end is to my mind is something that we need to sort of fight. It's an instinct. It's in all of us, right? That sunk cost fallacy. You spend more money repairing your car than just selling it and buying a new one. It happens to all of us, but it is an instinct that has to be resisted.
Yeah, vis-a-vis engines, my view is that it may not be right to say that we will get Kaveri, which is a high-end engine, a real high-performance engine, or nothing else. Engine technology is something that no one will part. No one. I mean, people are talking of SNECMA tying up with GTRE as part of the Rafale offsets and things like that. They will not part with the core engines, core engine technology. So let's be very clear. So the point at issue is that all our scientists who are there in GTRE, many of them, GTR, the Kaveri, we are hearing for the last, 30 years, 35? So those guys are retired and gone. But there was some knowledge pool, as you say, has been built up. That continuity has to happen. Nobody in the world will give you engine technology. That's for sure. Question from Ms. Oishi Kundu. She was with us as an intern in CAPS quite some 3-4 years back. And she says, since China is generally looking towards Taiwan, I mean, or the Western coast is the first threat, or the more important threat for China, can we coordinate our actions with the United States? Now, that's more of an IR question, of which you are a student of Oishi. But let's see, Angad, your answer.
That's a difficult one. I mean, can we coordinate? Of course we can. But will we? Is there a will? There are costs to taking the wraps off of that kind of coordination also that have to be weighed. I personally, speaking entirely in a personal capacity, I believe we should. I think that the time for restraint in cooperation is long past. And now that the gloves are off, even in China, then what's the point of pretending over here when we can just get on with it, really?
All right. The point at issue is that no country will fight your war.
Absolutely.
If we think that the Americans or anybody else is going to up another front for you, I think we are sadly mistaken. Every country has got its own problems. So when there are doubts of whether the Americans would fight the Europeans' war, nuclear, but that's heading on to a totally different setup. So let's get back to PLAF. Okay. Question from Commodore Anil Singh. In case it comes to a hot war, do you think what relative distances or depth can the two air forces strike? That's the question from Commodore Anil Singh.
That's the kind of question that's very, I don't want to say difficult to answer. It's one of those things that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because the nature of the conflict will decide the mission, not the other way around. But with that said, I mean, this whole thing opened, or one of the things we opened with was the bomber conundrum. So on pure numerical terms, yeah, they have the edge. They'll do a 4,500 kilometer strike, and we'll do half that, I think, with the Sukhoi family aircraft, with the Su-30 and standoff PGMs. But again, it doesn't. I mean, that answer only decides from what depth you launch your attack, because I don't think anyone's really chasing after Delhi and Beijing. It's going to be, if it does go hot, will be a localized kind of an issue. So you won't need those ranges to begin with, except as a means to protect your strike package.
Yeah, absolutely. I see the target selection is such an important part of striking, of any strike mission. What would happen if you are able to strike a target? Sometimes a target very deep down may have an effect, but may have an effect after 5 months, 6 months. So is it worth considering that you are interested in events next 10 days? So target selection and target strike, and of course, weapon to target matching, of course, this is in a way a science.
And then we get into a whole different loop of planning. I think it's also worth noting when we discuss hot and cold wars and things like that. It's something I've tried to bring out in this webinar itself. But India hasn't fought long wars. India doesn't, I mean, historically, we've 65, 71, 99. These were in a matter of weeks or months, and that was it. So these aren't the kind of sustained campaigns that one thinks of when one thinks of warfare, but it is nevertheless the kind of warfare that we have fought. So it is important to contextualize in that sense that how likely are we to, go on this massive World War II style bombing campaign, or how likely is it that we'll have to sustain aircraft in DCA, OCA roles for 6 months, 8 months at a time? We won't. In all likelihood, whatever outcome has to happen will probably happen inside of 2 weeks to a month.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a whole lot of international relations aspects that come in.
Absolutely.
Just a question from Mr. Umesh Gupta. Have you been able to access Chinese sources in your research, and how important are they in your deduction?
All my research is secondary sources. Unfortunately, I don't speak the language or read it. So it's mostly through secondaries. And I have to say, at this point, there is a fantastic author, Andreas Ruprecht, out of Germany, who he should be everyone's go-to source for Chinese air power, at least.
Yeah, and there is also the CASI, the CASI, the Chinese Aerospace something at the American Air University in Montgomery.
Yeah.
So these are sources which are pretty authentic.
It's all secondary sources, though. So it's not primary sources from China.
That's correct. That's correct, because a language is obviously a problem. Samanvay, you had a issue. You had a question. I think I saw that pop up. You want to ask a question?
Yeah. So considering that we're also reaching the end of our time, I'll just keep it as a broad thing that maybe you could move forward with. Last year, 2019, we saw responding to that Pulwama attack with airstrikes as a change. So maybe in a similar vein, do you see any role for the Indian Air Force in, say, small scale hostilities like what we just had at the border with China? Apart from airlift, do you see any different strike role for them as well in low level?
That's a difficult one, because there are many competing layers to this. I think it's important. Balakot was a sub-conventional strike. It was the MEA characterized it as a non-military strike, or rather as a strike against a non-military target. And I think that was intended to offer an off-ramp to avoid escalation. But not that it worked, but it's important that the intentions are nevertheless understood. So that experience will calibrate the next experience. And I think that it's important to note that what's happening now in the dark is not proxy war or sub-conventional. It is the uniforms are facing off against uniforms. It's not that there is no ambiguity there. So the idea of a punitive or a deterrent airstrike doesn't arise for any number of reasons, but certainly because of the escalation factor. So no, I don't think there's any the presence of air power, insofar as it has a deterrent effect, is all that matters at the moment. And then we get to Commodore Angad Singh's point of, if it does go hot, then that's a whole different series of questions and answers, and how far you want to take a particular conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the deterrence factor of the Indian Air Force. That is what is primary. If you recollect, about 4 months back, and I wrote about it, the fact suddenly our media was full of satellite photos of Chinese SAMs and Chinese radar systems being positioned in Tibet and opposite our forces generally. Basically indicating that they understand the threat from the Indian Air Force, and the fact that they have gaps, and they are trying to plug those gaps with those ground-based weapons. It is also an acknowledgement of the fact that they have an issue with the airborne element, which Angad, you brought out how they are trying to overcome that. But there is a point, those hangars, the hardened shelters which have come up. It's quite surprising. Those hardened shelters, if they are hardened shelters, are all in one line. I really don't know who would make hardened shelters all along one line. It just takes one stick to launch. So are we very sure that they are hardened, or are they aircraft protection for when they are parked in the open, so that the aircraft doesn't get heated up and avionics and things like that? So I really sometimes doubt those deductions or those statements to say that these are hardened shelters, because they're all in one line. If you see those satellite photos, and you won't park aircraft in one line, even under a hardened shelter. So, but be that as it may, maybe the analysts have studied it closely, and I don't have access to that. If there is any other question, just let me check if there is any. Well, there is none. Angad, would you like to have a closing comment before I close?
That's a difficult one. No, I think I'll leave that to you. But just to say that it's very easy to despair when one does these comparative comments, and I think that would be a mistake. And of course, it's not the intention. The idea is to identify areas where one has to prioritize and focus going forward. And I think that's I hope that's what we've done here today, and leave it at that.
That's right. In warfare, we have to be realistic, and we have to be true in our assessment. Because if we are not, then the problem will lie with us. We have certain plus points. We have issues which they can tackle. But presently, the Air Force, the Indian Air Force, actually provides the deterrent value, the factor. The Indian Army is there in full force. The Air Force is there not only in a supportive role, but with plans to strike, to prevent the firepower that can come on our ground forces, which are, which are Jawans, who are positioned in really tough situations. Thank you very much, Angad. We can carry on this debate of LAF versus IAF and various views that will come up. But it was a very nice exposition that you gave of your ideas. The important point that you actually brought out is that the gap in R&D, as well as the assets that use high-end technology, is increasing. We have some distance to cover. So possibly we have a time slot, a time gap in which to get our act together, get our R&D going, maybe get continuity in our research and development, the scientists, as I said, a czar for doing all this. That's the only way we can ensure that at least the momentum of the expansion of the gap doesn't increase any further. Thank you very much, Angad. It has been wonderful. And to all the viewers and all the participants who came, thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.
Kantha, can we close?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, AVM Bahadur, and thank you, Angad. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Angad.